inflation and a stagnant economy. That's stagflation, and it looks like we're heading to both of those in many parts of the world, almost certainly in the UK, perhaps in America as well. So what do we do about it? As we'll hear this time, it's different. So can you apply the same cure? Does the cure work anyway? I mean, central banks seem to think that pushing up interest rates will fix the inflation part of the equation, and maybe supply chains will fix themselves, and that's going to help too. But does lower inflation and supplies returning to normal, does that mean that the economy will start growing again? We are certainly in uncertain times. So what next? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, if you take May the 5th as the benchmark, that is when there were the most Google searches for the term stagflation. So if you set that as an index of 100 and you go back to February, the index on stagflation searches then was around 7 to 10. So that's how quickly this stagflation fear has gone from 10 to 100 in just a couple of months. So we weren't even thinking about it at the end of last year. But there is now, that Steve, this growing assumption that the world is heading for a recession, and there's nothing central banks can do to stop it, even though they perhaps think they can. In fact, arguably, you could say, they're helping bring it forward because they're pushing up interest rates. So recession with inflation is that is what stagnation is. How do we? Do you think? Well, okay. What is the definition? Do you think we're a load of questions for you? So I'm just going to go off and have a coffee. I'm going to load you up with the questions, Steve. So do you think? What is that? The definition of stagflation? Do you think we're going to get it, and how do we fight it?
We're going to go back and let's go back in history, because the first period of so-called stagflation is what led to the state of economics today, because the fact that you had rising prices and rising unemployment, that's fundamentally the definition of stagflation that came in the early 70s. And according to the conventional interpretation of Keynesian economics, that wasn't possible, because what you had in economic management was a belief in what was called the Phillips curve, and this was the result of research by a New Zealand engineer turned economist, Bill Phillips, who was one of the brightest and best humans have ever existed. I emphasise that, who was an engineer who wanted to bring engineering concepts across to economics. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. Okay, so he was bringing the whole idea of dynamic systems, feedback loops, all the stuff that I built in my Minsky software. He was doing back in the 50s, and he was literally doing it by making a water-based computer, and he made an analog computer before he actually had digital. He made an analog computer that was capable of modeling the economy using capacitors and resistors and so on for changing electric levels and all this sort of jazz. Now, as part of his model, he presumed that there'd be rising what he called factor prices during periods of high economic activity. And that's pretty much what we were talking about on the last podcast. When you had a booming economy, then there would be a possibility of high prices for oil, out of the boom, and also with low unemployment, high price for labour. So he literally hand drew this idea of a non-linear relationship. Below a certain level of economic activity, prices would be fairly constant. This is prices for labour and capital, for labour and raw material inputs. And then when you got a boom, those prices would go up quite sharply. And so he then went to check the data to see if he could verify this using English data on unemployment and the rate of change of money wages. So it wasn't the rate of inflation, it was the rate of change of money wages that he correlated with the level of unemployment. And he actually had to go back and assemble data from trade unions, because he went back to, I think it was 1861 or 1863 through to 1917 was his first data set. And back in those days, the government did not record how many people were unemployed, but the trade unions knew how many of the members were out of work. Because you're out of work, you didn't have to pay union dues, so they kept the records that way.
Right.
So he assembled all this data on the level of unemployment, and then he correlated to the rate of change of money wages, and that data was collected, again, fairly haphazardly. He had to put a few price series together. And what he got was exactly the sort of thing he expected to get, of a very nonlinear relationship between the level of unemployment and the rate of change of money wages. And this was all to explain to put numbers on an element he'd literally drawn in a circuit diagram of a feedback effect that would change the rate of inflation, largely given by the rate of unemployment. But this is why I get so annoyed when I see neoclassical economists saying things like the Phillips curve is dead, blah, blah, blah. In his paper where he put those statistical numbers together, he said there were 3 factors that determine the rate of change of money wages. 1 was the level of unemployment. 2 was the rate of change of unemployment. So he said if you had unemployment rising, then that would temper wage demands, even though the level of unemployment might be quite high. A level of unemployment might be quite low. If it's rising, that will temper wage demands. So you had a first-order effect, the level of unemployment, a second-order effect, the rate of change of unemployment, and the third factor is what he described in terms of import prices rising, and that's pretty much where your oil and coal comes in, because he said that there would be cost of living adjustments, and that would cause, and he literally, I think he has in his expression, a wage price spiral. Now, this is exactly what we spoke about later as what caused the so-called demise of the Phillips curve, but it wasn't. It was nowhere near as simplistic as the garbage that neoclassical economists. But isn't that
exactly where we are now? So we're getting. There's also the supply chain difficulties as well. But I mean, part of it is. But a chunk of it as well is the fact that people are asking for higher wages because there are so many jobs for whatever reason, the Great Resignation. Labour markets are very tight, and then
when you look back historically, this period, the mistake that Phillips did make. Was a throwaway line in the middle of his paper where he said that it looks like there's a trade-off between unemployment and the rate of inflation. If you want to have a low rate of unemployment, you have to have a high rate of inflation, and vice versa. And it made it like a menu, and he actually gave a couple of choices. If you wanted stable consumer prices, you needed a 5.5% rate of unemployment in the UK. If you wanted stable factor prices, you wanted a 7.5% rate of unemployment. Something of that nature.
So central banks heard that and read that and then said, well, okay, that's easy then. We'll just, if we want to get inflation down, we'll just destroy jobs. In effect, is what.
Yeah, and effectively, it made it look like there was a simple trade-off. Choose one number, you get the other. Okay, and then the crazy thing is when Phillips did that data from 1863 to 1917, I think it was, he then used to derive the curve that he used. He was using a handheld calculator. Actually, had to borrow a calculator from, I think it was UCL, I'm not sure. Borrow a calculator from the university he was at. He was the head of school. Take it over on the weekend and crunch the numbers by hand. And of course, he had about 60 data points, and that was just too damn hard back in the 50s with a manual calculator. So he summarised it down to 7 data ranges, and out of the 7 he got an average for the unemployment rate, an average to the rate of money change of money wages, and then fitted a logarithmic curve to that. And then when he used that curve to data later from 1917 through to I think 1956, then the data, with a couple of obvious exceptions which were easily explained, fitted that 1861 to 1917 data like a glove. And when it came out, people said, great, here's this simplify all the economic management. All we need to do is worry about these 2 variables and choose the numbers we want. Now, that was and Phillips, when he saw this happening, said that if he knew how his research would use, he would never have done it. So this is the sort of intellectual corruption that lies at the heart of modern economic management.
Well, it's not too complicated to understand what's happening right now, though, is it? We've got supply chain difficulties which are pushing up the prices of goods, including the price of energy, which has got the knock-on effect. And one of those knock-on effects is well, because we've got a tight labour market, is that people are able to choose where they work, plus so they're asking for higher wages, plus they have to ask for higher wages because everything's going up in price, and so it goes on. Does that create stagflation though?
It's again more complicated than there's very fundamental differences between what happened in the 70s and what's happening now.
So what is different? Well, to find out what is different and how we deal with it, you'll need to listen to the full version of this podcast. Sorry about that. You can do that by subscribing at debunkingeconomics.com or becoming a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. That's it for this week. Back again with another one. Thanks for listening.